Britain did not spring from a small set of islands, neat and self-contained. It was assembled over centuries from distant shores, stitched together by treaties and tariffs, plantations and ports, the hush of counting houses and the clang of shipyards. Wealth moved one way more than the other. Labor too. Cotton, tea and spices left warm latitudes and returned as dividends and soot, as terraces and railways and docks. In the ledger of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the empire's extractions underwrote a confidence that felt like destiny. The debt, unspoken, would come due in memory later. When cannons fell silent in 1945, victory sounded like an intake of breath through cracked lungs. Bomb sites gaped. Wards were understaffed. Foundries lacked hands. The call went out to those whom Britain already knew by law and language, the Commonwealth. They arrived on ships and night trains, carrying letters of introduction that were also histories: Jamaica and Punjab, Sylhet and Kingston, Mirpur and Port of Spain. They came not as strangers, but as the people whose labour had already turned Britain's wheels. They came because a country asked, and because the routes made by empire still ran like lines in the water. The welcome was real in contracts and pay packets, and conditional at the corner shop. Work taken to keep buses running and wards open was a cast, on certain front pages and in some pubs, as jobs stolen. Gratitude had a short half-life. Each decade learned to speak its fear in a new accent. In the 1930s, Jews. In the 1950s and 60s, Black Britons. In the 1970s, South Asians. The faces changed, the sentence stayed the same. When wages stalled or prices rose, someone would say that prosperity could be restored if only the door were shut behind the last arrival. But to understand the temperature of our present, you must hold your hand to the furnace that fed it. In India, the colonial drain of wealth became policy and habit. Resources crossed the seas as if pulled by tide, markets opened and closed like a hand. The figure historians sometimes quote is a number so large it bends comprehension, matters less than the pattern. For 200 years, extraction and advantage flowed toward the metropole, and with them the confidence to imagine Britain as the inevitable winner of any game it chose to play. Factory chimneys and shipyard cranes rose from those years, and the profits were not shared evenly at home either. Class, like empire, sorted who breathed soot for whom. The war years took their own levy. Afterwards, immigration became the hinge on which recovery turned. People say Windrush and mean a boat. What they often forget is the bargain. The country needed nurses, porters, drivers, cleaners, welders. It needed teachers and clerks and engineers. The country needed breath. The Commonwealth replied. Lives were packed into suitcases. A generation taught itself to sleep next to new noises. They learned the price of houses and the names of streets, and the feeling of being told to go back to places the speaker could not find on a map. Still, mornings came and uniforms were put on, and shift by shift, the country learned to stand again. Kashmiris came too, drawn by the same call and the narrower choices of post-partition life. They took the hard and poorly paid jobs, the hours that make the hands ache, foundries and mills, night shifts and line work. Some sent money home, some brought families over later, translating between languages and expectations at the kitchen table. Their work, like so much essential labor, disappeared into the smooth surface of what everyone else took for granted. There was always another story running alongside, the one where immigrants are a hole in the hull. In the 1930s, Jewish refugees arriving in small numbers were blamed for the unemployment that followed a crash they did not cause. The old caricatures dusted themselves off for another performance, and foreign became an explanation elastic enough to fit any grievance. It is not that lies convene out of nothing, they assemble around need. The function of a scapegoat is not accuracy, it is direction. Anger looks down the street instead of up the system. In the post-war decades, Caribbean families stepped into the bargain and found its limits. Access to work did not open every door. Pubs advertised standards that were not about beer. Rooms were let and then suddenly not. The job promised turned out to be the job that came with jokes, the kind that try to turn a person into a shape small enough to fit someone else's comfort. Yet buses ran because drivers and conductors turned up. Hospitals functioned because nurses and porters did. A country's thanks should be measured in more than speeches. By the 1970s, the economy faltered and suspicion shifted its gaze. South Asian families were told they crowded schools, bent the queue, drained the state. Policies tightened, accents were weighed. The arithmetic of who belonged was done with different numbers for different names. On marches and in back rooms, some said purity would pay the bills. It did not. Meanwhile, in workshops and surgeries and corner shops, the ordinary miracle of a city carried on, stock taken, stitches made, lights kept on. Step back from the noise and ask what immigration actually did. It filled shortages in the parts of the economy where shortages cut deepest. The health service became in part a map of the world. Wards spoke in many accents, and a patient's pulse washed by hands trained in other countries and honed here. Construction, transport, hospitality, the skeleton of daily life, stood because shifts were covered. The Treasury's sums, when done carefully, pointed to net contributions that grew as people settled, worked, and built. Diversity ceased to be a slogan and became the texture of a high street. Roti next to roast, bhangra next to brass bands, the Friday queue snaking between them. Of course there were strains. Any map that adds people must redraw services, schools, GPs, buses, bins. When investment lagged migration, pressure showed up in precisely the places where trust is scarcest: the clinic waiting room, the housing list, the classroom corridor. It is tempting then for some to blame people who are visible rather than policies that are not. But a slow passport printer is not an argument against travel, it is an argument for a better printer. In the last decade, new banners were raised by familiar hands. Britain first, two words that, depending on who said them and how, could sound like a promise or a threat. In some speeches and on some streets, difference was turned into danger. Free speech was claimed as a shield for the sharpest words, even as their edge nicked at the boundaries that protect us all. A country must hold both truths at once. That expression is a freedom wide enough for argument and art, and that incitement is not a synonym for candor. Drawing that line is the work of law and courage both. And then there are those who come not for work, but for safety. The word asylum is older than the front pages. It means sanctuary, a place where danger cannot follow. Cases take months, sometimes years. A person becomes paperwork. Skills curdle in the waiting. The story that spreads is not of the bombing or the persecution left behind, but of a queue viewed from the outside. If we are to be the country we think we are, then the process must be faster, the answers clearer, and the welcome, when offered, more than a bed for a night. Brexit, when it came, used the word sovereignty like a key. Some felt that borders had grown porous, not just to people but to explanations, that decisions were made elsewhere, by strangers, in a language that did not care for their town. The vote was not a single story, it was a bundle of fears and hopes and histories. What it could not do by itself was reopen a shipyard or shorten a waiting list. Borders tell you who enters. Budgets and training tell you who heals you when you are ill. To ask immigration to carry the weight of every loss is to set it up to fail and to ignore the levers, investment, productivity, regional strategy, that history shows actually move prosperity. Walk the country with this in mind, and you see two drafts of Britain at once. In one, identity is a room with a single window and one chair. The past is polished so brightly you can use it as a mirror, though it only reflects the person holding it. In the other, identity is a table with leaves that fold out when guests arrive, and the argument over how to set it is part of dinner. Music from the Caribbean and South Asia shares weekends with brass and choir. Festivals layer themselves over the calendar like careful lace. Children translate for parents at GP surgeries and then teach the same parents slang their grandparents would not understand. The result is not dilution, it is change, the everyday, sometimes clumsy, often tender process by which a place becomes itself again. History doesn't absolve, it explains. Empire arranged the world so Britain could profit. Post-imperial migration followed the lines it drew. To pretend there is no connection is to ask newcomers to run a race whose starting gun sounded 2 centuries ago and to scold them for appearing on the track at all. Fairness begins with naming the inheritance honestly. It continues with policy that meets reality, money for schools that teach children in many tongues, support for councils where populations grew faster than budgets, training so the person just out of work in Sunderland sees a ladder and not a trap. It means processing asylum claims in weeks and months, not in years that fray the mind. It means remembering when the next downturn arrives, and it always does, that the easier story is rarely the truer one. There is a quieter arithmetic at work in kitchens and break rooms. A nurse who arrived 10 years ago is now the senior who trains others. A bus driver becomes a depot supervisor. A child who translated letters for her father now drafts contracts, carefully, professionally, so nobody can be told their signature is not valid. Corner shops turn into wholesalers, restaurants into small chains, apprentices into masters. It is not that there are no tensions. It is that the ordinary fact of living together tends to outrun the worst predictions. We have told the immigrant as burden tale before. It has not made the rent cheaper or the trains faster. We have also told another tale, though not loudly enough, that when people arrive and are given their chance, they pay taxes and buy boots and school uniforms. They start firms and volunteer at schools. They bring recipes and jokes and griefs and skills, and a country large enough to admit complexity becomes, by degrees, more itself. The Migration Advisory Committee, when it has peered into the numbers, has often found a net positive. So the question is not whether Britain can belong to those who have come. The question is whether Britain can belong to itself, its whole self, including the facts that feel untidy. The cranes on the skyline rose with money earned overseas. The hospitals that treat us are staffed by hands trained elsewhere and here. The music that fills a summer evening would be thinner if history had stayed within a neat border. To deny any of that is to choose a smaller country than the one we live in. Imagine for a moment a ledger that could hold everything. On one side, loss. Factories moved, wages stalled, a world shifting underfoot. On the other, gain, skills imported and grown, taxes paid, meals shared, children learning to say "we" in a way their grandparents could not. What accountant could balance such a book? And yet that is the work of politics, the slow addition of fairness to fact. It starts with refusing the cheap arithmetic of blame. Britain is an argument that has been going on for a very long time. That is part of its strength. It survives by revising itself, by letting more people speak in the meeting and still getting to a vote. When we say British values, We mean a set of habits that take practice, tolerance that is active rather than smug, free expression that does not mistake cruelty for honesty, law that distinguishes between dissent and harm, a seriousness about history that does not flinch from the parts that ache. These are not decorations. They are the tools by which we maintain a country big enough for all the lives already being lived inside it. There will be another downturn. There always is. The temptation will be to reach for the oldest sentence in the file. Resist it. Ask instead, what would make work secure, training real, services responsive? Ask what would rebuild trust between people who share a street but not yet a story. Remember who came when the country asked. Remember who paid when the country was paid. Remember the lines in the water and how they became bridges. In a century's time, someone will tell this part of the story with the confidence that comes from distance. Let them say that when the choice arrived between a tidy falsehood and a messy truth, we chose the truth and then did the work it required. Let them say that belonging did not mean sameness, it meant promise kept. Let them say that immigration did not break Britain. It helped build it, again, because we were brave enough to admit what had already been written into our streets, our hospitals, our ledgers, and our lives.